Oh, Waycross, he's gonna be decapitated. His head is decapitated. Go ahead, send me everybody you got.
On July 3, 2024, a blue Kawasaki motorcycle fled from Georgia State's patrol troopers weaving through traffic at dangerous speeds before crashing into a tree near the Nahunta post office. The rider, 45-year-old Mark Edward Johns of Brunswick, was pronounced dead at the scene. His death has sparked a fierce debate about police pursuit policies in Georgia, a debate that questions whether the chase was worth the cost and whether similar tragedies can be prevented. As investigators piece together the final moments, a community confronts with loss while demanding accountability and reform. The morning of July 3, 2024, began like any other day in Brantley County, Georgia. The sun had barely risen over the rural highways that connect small towns like Nahunta to the wider world. Traffic was light, and most residents were preparing for Independence Day celebrations. But at approximately 7:56 a.m., a sequence of events began that would end in tragedy and raise troubling questions about law enforcement practices that persist across the state. According to the Georgia State Patrol, troopers observed a blue Kawasaki motorcycle traveling northbound on GA-23 at high speed. The exact speed has not been officially disclosed, but witnesses and patrol transcripts suggest the motorcycle was traveling well above posted limits.
Coming back into the city. It's gonna be occupied one white male on a blue motorcycle, black shirt. Alright, we're coming in the city limits now.
What happened next followed a familiar pattern. A trooper attempted to initiate a traffic stop, likely activating emergency lights and signaling the rider to pull over. Instead of obeying, the motorcycle took off, transforming a routine traffic violation into a high-speed chase through Brantley County's roadways. The chase unfolded rapidly, with the motorcycle accelerating away from chasing troopers. The rider navigated through traffic, making split-second decisions that put both himself and other motorists at risk. Patrol dashboard camera footage referenced in public compilations, though not officially released in full, captures the intensity of the pursuit. The motorcycle weaved between vehicles, accelerated through intersections, and pushed the limits of what the machine and rider could handle. For troopers following behind, each moment presented a calculation: continue the pursuit or terminate for public safety. The critical moment came at the intersection of GA-23 and GA-520, one of the busier crossroads in this rural area. According to Georgia State Patrol reports, the motorcycle ran a red signal at this intersection, blowing through the light without slowing. In an attempt to pass another vehicle, the motorcycle struck the vehicle's side mirror, a seemingly minor contact that would prove fatal. The impact disrupted the motorcycle's balance and path, causing the rider to lose control. What followed happened in seconds, but would be analyzed for months. The motorcycle left the roadway near Burton Street, close to the Nahunta post office, a location familiar to locals as a quiet area where such violence seemed unimaginable. The bike struck a tree with devastating force. The impact was fatal, and despite the rapid response of emergency personnel, Mark Edward Johns was pronounced dead at the scene. The chase that began with a speeding violation ended with a man's life lost and a community left to question whether it had to happen this way. The official Georgia State Patrol statement provided the basic facts, but left many questions unanswered. How long had the pursuit lasted? Had troopers followed proper protocol in initiating and continuing the chase? Were there opportunities to terminate the pursuit before it reached the fatal intersection? And perhaps most importantly, was the initial violation serious enough to justify a chase that ended in death? For investigators tasked with reconstructing the incident, the evidence was both plentiful and limited. Dashboard camera footage provided visual documentation of the chase, showing the motorcycle's unpredictable movements and the moment of impact. Witness statements from other motorists described the fear of seeing a motorcycle and police vehicles racing past them at dangerous speeds. Physical evidence at the crash site, skid marks, debris patterns, and the condition of the motorcycle helped reconstruct the final moments. Yet despite all this evidence, fundamental questions about decision-making and policy compliance remained difficult to answer. The timing of the crash on a holiday morning when families were preparing for celebrations added another layer of tragedy to the incident. Independence Day, meant to be a time of community gathering and patriotic celebration, became instead a day of grief for those who knew Mark Johns and a day of reflection for those questioning pursuit policies that allow such chases to continue. Georgia State Patrol identified the deceased rider as 45-year-old Mark Edward Johns of Brunswick, Georgia. Yet, beyond this basic identification, the public record remains frustratingly limited. Unlike high-profile cases that quickly generate detailed biographical portraits, Mark Johns' life story has largely remained private, known primarily to family and friends, rather than broadcast to a wider audience. This lack of information itself raises important questions about how different victims are treated in public discourse and media coverage. What we know with certainty is limited but significant. Mark was 45 years old at the time of his death, with many years of life experience behind him and potentially many more years ahead. He lived in Brunswick, a coastal Georgia city known for its historic downtown, shrimp industry, and location near the Golden Isles. Brunswick is approximately 30 miles southeast of Nahunta, suggesting Mark was traveling away from home that morning, though his destination and purpose remain unknown to the public. The circumstances of his identification presented their own challenges. Many people share similar names, and public records reveal multiple individuals named Mark Edward Johns across different states and regions. Unrelated death notices exist for people with this name in places as distant as Alaska, creating potential confusion for anyone attempting to research his background. This name overlap underscores the importance of proper verification through official channels, coroner's reports, death certificates, and family confirmation before drawing conclusions about identity or personal history. What remains unclear is Mark's personal story, his occupation, his family situation, his interests and passions, his community connections. Did he have children? Was he married? What did he do for work? What brought him to that highway on that particular morning?
Clear, clear. Coming up on Brantley Street.
These gaps in the public narrative stand in stark contrast to cases where victims receive extensive media coverage, complete with childhood photos, statements from friends, and detailed explorations of their character and accomplishments. This disparity in coverage itself merits examination. When victims of police pursuits or law enforcement encounters receive minimal biographical attention, it becomes easier to focus only on the chase, the violation, and the legal questions while losing sight of the human being whose life was lost. Mark Edward Johns was not simply the rider or the motorcyclist who tried to escape. He was a person with a history, relationships, and a life that mattered to those who knew him. For journalists and investigators working to tell this story comprehensively, several critical steps remain necessary. The coroner's official death certificate would provide legal confirmation of Mark's full name and identity, eliminating any confusion with similarly named individuals. The full police incident report would offer details about any previous contact between Mark and law enforcement, providing context for why he might have attempted to escape. Most importantly, reaching out to family members through funeral homes, local newspapers, or community connections would give them an opportunity to share who Mark was beyond the circumstances of his death. The absence of readily available information also reflects broader patterns in how stories are told and whose lives receive full examination. Victims who die in circumstances involving their own decisions, whether attempting to escape from police, engaging in risky behavior, or making split-second choices with fatal consequences, often receive less sympathetic coverage than those regarded as entirely innocent victims. This framing can hide important truths: that every person's life has value, that understanding the full context helps prevent future tragedies, and that policy reform requires examining what leads people to make dangerous decisions in the first place. If Mark Johns had family in Brunswick, they are now left to grieve without the public support often extended to victims in other circumstances. If he had friends or colleagues, they grieve a loss that may go largely unacknowledged beyond their immediate circle. And if he had a story struggles he faced, dreams he pursued, mistakes he regretted, or kindnesses he extended, that story remains largely untold. known only to those who knew him personally. The Pursuit Policy, Debate, Law, Liability, and Reform. Mark John's death did not occur alone, but rather sits within a broader context of police pursuit policies that have generated intense debate across Georgia and the nation. Understanding what happened on July 3, 2024, requires examining the legal framework, department policies, and ongoing reform efforts that govern when and how law enforcement chases suspects attempting to escape. The Georgia Department of Public Safety operates under a written pursuit policy, Policy 17.02, that establishes guidelines for when troopers should initiate, continue, or terminate high-speed chases. This policy attempts to balance competing interests: the law enforcement responsibility to capture offenders and enforce traffic laws against the very real danger that pursuits pose to officers, suspects, and innocent bystanders. The policy prioritizes safety but ultimately leaves considerable discretion to individual officers and their training, recognizing that split-second decisions in dynamic situations cannot be fully governed by rigid rules. Under Georgia law and established case law, officers who initiate pursuits are generally not automatically liable for injuries or deaths that result, even when the pursuit ends in tragedy. The legal standard requires demonstrating that officers acted with gross negligence in initiating or continuing the chase, a high bar that acknowledges the inherent dangers of police work while also providing some accountability for unreasonable decisions. This legal protection reflects a policy choice. Society has decided that pursuing lawbreakers serves important public safety interests that outweigh some level of risk. However, this legal framework has come under increasing examination as data reveals the true cost of pursuit policies. Investigative reporting, particularly from outlets like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, has documented alarming patterns in how frequently Georgia State Patrol pursuits end in crashes, injuries, and deaths. These investigations have revealed cases where pursuits for minor violations intensified into deadly crashes, where innocent bystanders were killed by fleeing vehicles, and where policy violations by officers went unpunished. The data paints a troubling picture of a system where the immediate goal of making an arrest too often overshadows careful risk assessment. The debate over pursuit reform centers on several key questions. First, what violations justify initiating a high-speed chase? There is broad acknowledgement that serious crimes of violence such as armed robbery, kidnapping, physical attacks warrant pursuit even at significant risk. But what about traffic violations, property crimes, or drug offenses? If Mark Johns was initially stopped for speeding, did that violation justify a chase through populated areas? Reform advocates argue for much stricter limitations, suggesting that pursuits should be reserved only for cases where the suspect poses an immediate violent threat to public safety. Second, what factors should warrant termination of an ongoing pursuit? Current policies consider factors like traffic density, weather conditions, speeds reached, and the nature of the original offense. But critics argue these guidelines are too imprecise and too deferential to officer judgment in the heat of the moment. They advocate for clearer, more restrictive rules: automatic termination after a certain duration, mandatory termination in residential areas, or use of technology like Jeeps tracking devices and helicopters as alternatives to ground pursuit. Third, who bears responsibility when pursuits go wrong? Currently, the legal system largely places responsibility on the fleeing suspect, reasoning that the decision to flee created the dangerous situation. But reform advocates point out that suspects often make poor decisions under pressure, influenced by fear, impairment, outstanding warrants, or panic. They argue that trained law enforcement officers should bear greater responsibility for risk assessment and decision-making, particularly when the initial offense is relatively minor. The policy debate also encompasses technological solutions that could reduce the need for dangerous pursuits. Jeeps tracking darts that can be fired at fleeing vehicles, license plate readers connected to databases that enable later apprehension, and airborne monitoring using helicopters or drones all offer alternatives to ground pursuit. These technologies carry costs and their own complications, but they represent options that could prevent deaths like Mark Johns. For law enforcement agencies and officers, the pursuit debate presents genuine challenges. Officers are trained to enforce the law and detain violators, and allowing suspects to flee with impunity sends a message that evasion works. There are legitimate concerns that overly restrictive pursuit policies would encourage more people to flee, knowing that police will break off the chase. Finding the right balance requires acknowledging both the risks of pursuit and the risks of allowing suspects to escape. What is clear is that the current system, which resulted in Mark Johns' death over what appears to have been a speeding violation, requires careful examination and likely reform. The question is not whether pursuits should ever occur, but rather when the risks outweigh the benefits and how policy can better protect all lives involved. The investigation into Mark Johns' death covers multiple layers of evidence, from official incident reports to publicly circulated footage, each piece contributing to a fuller understanding of what occurred and what lessons can be learned. The official evidence trail begins with the Georgia State Patrol Incident Report, a document that should detail the initial observation, the decision to pursue, the chase's progression, and the deadly collision. This report represents the troopers' official account and includes critical information about speeds, duration, radio communications, and decision points throughout the pursuit.
Yeah. White Cross ain't much I can do. I gotta do CPR. His head is decapitated.
The post-mortem examination may also reveal whether any contributing factors existed, such as impairment, medical conditions, or protective equipment failures. These findings can inform both the specific investigation and broader policy discussions about motorcycle safety and pursuit protocols. Dashcam and bodycam footage represents perhaps the most valuable evidence, offering objective visual documentation of the pursuit from law enforcement's perspective. Georgia State Patrol vehicles are equipped with cameras designed to record traffic stops and pursuits, capturing video and audio that can verify or challenge written reports. However, access to this footage often proves difficult, with agencies citing investigative needs, privacy concerns, or legal restrictions when withholding release to the public. Beyond official channels, publicly available evidence has emerged through various means. Dashcam compilation videos uploaded to platforms like YouTube sometimes include footage from this or similar pursuits, though authenticity and context can be difficult to verify. Social media posts from witnesses may provide additional perspectives, though these accounts must be carefully evaluated for accuracy. Video footage shows what happened but cannot fully explain why the trooper's thought process in continuing the pursuit, Mark Johns' decision to flee, and his state of mind. Physical evidence at the crash site documents the final impact, but cannot determine whether earlier action could have prevented it. Even comprehensive evidence leaves gaps that require judgment calls about policy adherence and reasonable conduct. Community reaction to the crash has been muted compared to some high-profile pursuit deaths, perhaps reflecting the rural setting, the absence of extensive media coverage, or the circumstances of Mark Johns fleeing from police. Local residents in Nahunta and Brantley County expressed concern about dangerous driving and law enforcement presence, but organized advocacy or protest has been limited. This relatively quiet response stands in stark contrast with cases where victims were clearly innocent or where officer misconduct was obvious, highlighting how public sympathy varies based on perceived responsibility. Nevertheless, Mark Johns' death contributes to a growing body of evidence that has driven the broader pursuit reform movement in Georgia. Investigative journalists have compiled databases of pursuit-related deaths, demonstrating patterns that individual cases alone might not reveal. Advocacy organizations have used these cases to pressure legislators and law enforcement agencies to reconsider policies that prioritize arrest over safety. Each death, including Mark's, adds weight to arguments for reform. The path forward requires multiple stakeholders to take specific measures. Law enforcement agencies should conduct thorough after-action reviews of every pursuit that results in death or serious injury, examining whether policies were followed and whether policy itself requires revision. State legislators should consider pursuit reform legislation that establishes clearer standards for when chases can occur and when they must be terminated. Choices made within a policy framework that could be reformed to value life more highly than immediate enforcement. What started as a traffic stop ended with a life lost, and questions that continue to demand answers. As investigators complete their review and community moves forward, Mark Edward Johns' death should not be forgotten or dismissed as simply the cost of law enforcement. Whether reforms come through policy changes, better training, or new technologies, the goal must be preventing future tragedies. Every life matters, including those who make mistakes, and a just system protects everyone, even those who attempt to evade arrest. If you believe stories like this need to be told, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more, and share it to spread awareness.